You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the 95 Podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director at 95 Network, hanging out with John Wilson today. John's got a new book out we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But before we do that, we want to kind of get to know him and his heart for the church. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dale. Thanks so much for having me on. Just so exciting to share with you and just the conversations we have about helping pastors. And in my case, I like to say it mobilize the church full of leaders. So I'm just really excited to connect today.
Where do you live?
I'm in the Philadelphia area, so I'm outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be riding right by you this summer when I come to a
Coming
conference.
up soon, Lidditz, right?
I'm glad to meet you because I didn't know how to say the name of the town I was going to be in. So what did you call it?
Lidditz.
Lidditz. Okay, yeah, I would never figure that out.
One that you may get into trouble with is Lancaster. It's Lancaster. It's not Lancaster. And,
I understand that. I learned that one. I've actually been to Lancaster, so I understood. I've been told the correct way. And the other one I've been really held to the fire on is when you go to Long Island, New York. You're on Long Island. You're not in it. Very important that you don't say you're in Long Island. You'll make them mad. So it's important to know all these things we know when we travel.
Right.
Take a few minutes and kind of tell us a little bit of your backstory and what you do, John.
Sure, absolutely. So I actually spent a lot of my career in the technology industry. I was in technology for over 20 years, but in the last 5 years, really felt called by God to leave the commercial space and to just get involved in some entrepreneurial ventures and also to teach entrepreneurship at a very large university. And all along, there's been this thread from the time I was 4 years old to the time that I was really studying the Bible intensely for the first time in my life. And then again, as a PhD candidate studying biblical foundations of organizational leadership. And then now in the last couple of years, this just interest in the book of Nehemiah. And so a lot of the book that I've written here is kind of a compilation of different experiences God has had with me when it came to leadership and drawing my attention to this book of the Bible that's really often overlooked. And so in the last few years, just doors were open for me to really do some work in the church that I'm a part of. I'm a lay leader in the church that I'm in. Oftentimes I remind everyone I'm not a pastor. I don't do this for a living, but I have been very involved as a worship leader. I've been involved as a community group leader, and I've been involved in helping our church leaders as an executive coach to our lead pastor, and also just to do strategic planning. And it culminated into a workshop series that we did to try to mobilize leaders within our church and really move them from the kind of pew potato status, as we like to say it, to mobilized on mission. And so, and what we've kind of then dubbed mission mobilizers, those that are really kind of leading others. And so that's been a lot of what's been really behind this book was just that background, that interest in this topic.
You said you went to study entrepreneurship. Is that a big topic? Is that a popular subject, or is it still kind of behind the scenes?
Yeah, entrepreneurship is growing. It's interesting. When I was working on my PhD in organizational leadership in the 2009 2010 timeframe, leadership was the big topic.
Yes.
And that seems to have shifted in academia. Entrepreneurship is now a really big topic. So it was timely. I was studying organizational leadership with an emphasis on entrepreneurship. My focus has become what's called entrepreneurial leadership. And for a number of years, I said I help accidental entrepreneurs to thrive. And what I discovered is I really get to know more and more pastors and work with more and more pastors. They are the ultimate accidental entrepreneur. They just don't know it sometimes, they're starting something new.
All right, you got to dive into that. What does it mean to be an accidental entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny. I think it first started, I worked with an entrepreneur for a number of years And he had an expression. He said, I'm a designer by trade and an entrepreneur by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And it really struck me when I looked at it through that lens. All the people that I've worked with and really helped the most in my career are those that are entrepreneurs, but they didn't go about being an entrepreneur. They had a passion, a skill, a product, or something that they wanted to do or start.
Mm-hmm.
And they did just were like, hey, I don't have a business background. I don't know where to begin. And so, that's something I've just applied that to as a business leader, as a senior leader in a technology software industry for a long period of time. And then just as a church leader, as an entrepreneur myself. And so these accidental entrepreneurs are those ones that are like, I think I want to start something. And I would say pastors, ministry leaders, they really feel called by God to start something. I've even found myself recently talking with a lot of missionaries who are like, hey, I got to start a business now because I'm somewhere in the world where I need to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
these are, situations where it's like the entrepreneurial activity was not intentional. So it wasn't the set out to like, hey, I want to go be an entrepreneur and start a business. It's I have this purpose, this mission, or this calling. And now I need the skills, or I need someone who can kind of guide that way. And so it's just been interesting seeing this journey of working with commercial entrepreneurs, and then how it really led me in a path to help my pastors do very many of the same kinds of things, and now trying to really just spread some of those resources to other pastors that would find it useful.
We have a teammate, John Sanders, that I've mentioned to you, and obviously our listeners know John very well, who has a ministry that's called Entre Pastors. And the heartbeat behind it is to create opportunities for pastors, quote unquote, not to starve, because we work with a lot of small and mid-sized church leaders who don't make enough income really to live at a decent, when I say decent level, I mean probably just what should be. And so his whole thing is entrepreneurship to be able to provide income. But your focus is a little different, is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it is in the sense that pastors are engaged in an entrepreneurial venture. And I use the kind of original term of original definition of entrepreneurship. Derek Litto described it as someone who starts something.
Okay.
And that's, oftentimes, even if a pastor is stepping into a church that already exists, they're starting a new ministry in a sense, because they have a new calling, they have a new mission, and they're starting something. And so a lot of the same skills that help somebody start a new business or launch a new product also help someone to really think in terms of, how do I organize people? How do I inspire people? How do I mobilize people around this mission and this calling that God's placed on my heart?
I think this is a new thought because typically when you take a church, you just kind of build on what someone else did and you kind of fall into that role. But what you're saying is to take a fresh approach and see, okay, what is available? What is possible? What is outside the box, if you will? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And, innovation and change and transformation can feel a little scary.
Yeah.
But we're
Well,
seeing
now,
it.
to be fair, now churches aren't really, they're not known for those words.
No, they are not.
They're not known for those words.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think there is some aspect of, the gospel doesn't change.
Yes.
God doesn't change. The mission of the church will not change. But for those that are really wanting to be salt and light in the world, for pastors that are really wanting to lead a ministry that is bringing that ancient truth, and also, but bringing it in a way that is, relevant and connects in the world today. And I don't mean, when I say relevant, the gospel is always relevant.
Sure.
So I don't want to be misstate that, but is just connected to what's happening in the world around. And so, in a lot of ways, what I'm finding, the pastors that are really gravitating towards this idea, the Nehemiah Way, and just some of the things that I'm doing is, they're still relatively young pastors. I'd say probably millennials, is if you want to, put that category in place. But I would also say they're those that are really ambitious for gospel mission, that are really looking at, how do I, do everything I can. God's going to do this with or without me, right?
Yes.
And that was what we saw in Nehemiah. The wall would have been built, the city would have been built, the nation would have been built, the stage would have been set for the passion and all those things without him. But he was faithful in taking action and being part of what God was doing. And that's the mindset that seems to really gravitate towards this. Someone who's saying, I want to bring the gospel to a lot of people. And for those that are in the church, I want to, refresh the gospel every day in discipleship. And to do that, it's more work than one person can do on their own. I mean,
Yeah.
God gave us this community of believers to share the load, to share the burden, and it's also just to have the opportunity to be involved in this mission. So that's really the distinction there, is that those that are ambitious for gospel mission and ready to like jump in and embrace maybe new approaches to things that don't change the fundamentals of what we believe.
I've been in ministry 40 plus years. And so I was part of when things began to shift toward leadership, when John Maxwell, Bill Hybels, the Fuller, all those guys were introducing more of leadership mentality of pastoring. And there was pushback then that, well, if you'd hear people say stuff like, well, if God wants the church to grow, he'll grow it, which I can't believe people say that stuff. But anyway, they did. But there was always pushback toward leadership principles. And oddly enough, I still see today from time to time someone who's just, antagonistic about developing your leadership, growing your leadership, becoming a leader of people, which is honestly, according to Ephesians 4, our job is to equip people. So, I mean, if you don't want to call it leadership, call it equipping, okay, to make you feel better. The point of sharing that is, do you have pushback when you start introducing this concept when you deal with churches?
Yeah, not a whole lot, but I do think there is some self-selection. Those that are interested in talking to me for more than 5 minutes are thinking in terms of, how do I be the best steward of this ministry that I can? Mm-hmm. And so the idea of leadership development, it is interesting. As I've started to talk with pastors about this, I can't count the number of people, even in the last month or so, that have said leadership development is the main thing we're thinking about right now.
Really?
So there's obviously
Yay.
this moment. Yeah, I know, right?
We're finally getting there.
Like perfect timing. Like, have you met Dale Sellers? That's the
We've been trying to get you there for 40 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do think, I think it's one of those self-selection. Someone who's doesn't have energy in that idea probably won't engage as much, but I'm finding more, particularly younger pastors, those that are really thinking about, how to, there's more of the thought process of, ministry is, maybe 30, 40 years long, for someone that has a good run. And what's the way that I can make the most impact? And I don't think it's not a question of God's sovereignty is always right on top, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
As believers, we get this opportunity to get involved with what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And, how exciting is that? And how powerful an opportunity is that for discipleship within the church, while simultaneously really seeking to spread the gospel. And so this is where I'm encouraged by the pastors I'm talking with that are thinking in these terms, and thinking in terms of like, I am not going to be able to do this all myself.
Yeah.
Because I think I've met plenty of pastors. They're drowning.
Yes.
They're exhausted. Yep. They're burned out. They sometimes it just almost seems like they feel like they're losing their faith almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's self-inflicted.
It is. I was with a pastor friend. I won't obviously not who is, but I actually have worked with this church many, many times, and we were doing a Zoom cohort together, and we're talking through some stuff. And again, you've picked up on it. I mean, I know the importance of leadership. And so, and at some point in that call, he goes, well, to be honest with you, I've never really spent much time working on leadership principles. Well, we were together on that call, and he's talking about how tired he is, how worn out he is, how he's going here and there. And he was like leaving this call to go get pizza for a youth thing. And this is the lead pastor of a church of several hundred people. And I just looked at him and I called his name. I said, what is wrong with you? And so what I've discovered is this, and I want you to speak to this. At 95 Network, the reason we say 95 is because, when we created this, 95% of all the churches in America were small or mid-size, which means under 500, and then 87% under 200, and 75% were under 100. That was before COVID. So reduce those numbers by about 30% seems to be about what's accurate now. And one of the things that we notice is the reason that so many churches are small is because pastors don't lead. They don't hand off stuff. They don't raise up people, and they either do it for one of two reasons. One, because they need to be needed, or two, that's what the congregation demands of them. Right. Have you run into that?
I have. And I think it's a real challenge for a pastor where the expectation is that they're mowing the lawn and they're setting up the chairs for Sunday and they're doing the sermon.
And they get a pat on the back for it.
Right. Yeah. And
they don't get paid for it necessarily, but they get a nice pat on the back.
Right. Often, yeah, many times barely making subsistent
Yep.
wages to be able to even pay for their family. And having to think about, okay, of the 70 hours I'm working on the church, I got to squeeze out another 10 hours of doing some part-time work just to pay the bills. And there's that expectation and almost that sense of, hey, we're paying you, you take care of all of it. And that's, I think, where that's a really tough spot to be in for pastor, because not only are they feeling it, but there's also this almost expectation of it. But I find there are a lot of pastors that the expectation isn't there. In fact, people are sitting in the seats every Sunday morning for, an hour and a half and leave, and just they come back again next week. And yeah, we call them pew potatoes. They're good people. They're usually highly skilled, competent, qualified people that would be willing to get involved. And maybe not just volunteer, but even to lead, but they're not asked, or they don't feel it's their place, or they see the pastor's got everything under control. So they're just showing up. And, most pastors have that 80-20, that, Prada principle of 20% of the people are doing all the work. And I just spoke at a conference recently, and I said in the room, I said, how's that 20-80 thing sit with you? Raise your hand if 20% of your congregation being involved would be great. And a third of the audience raised their hand. And so you could see that it's even that 20-80 is kind of a misnomer.
Yeah, it's more like 595.
Yeah,
if we're honest. Yeah. I don't want this to slide by, because we just talked about this, and I try to bring this up when I can. But I want to say this to you: if you're a part-time pastor, what I mean is you're bivocational, which is fine. In fact, sometimes we think it's healthier for you to be bivocational. If you're bivocational, you cannot work at the church full time. So if the church will not pay you full time, or it's just a situation, you cannot put that guilt on yourself to feel like you've got to provide all the things that someone who's getting paid full time can provide. There's not enough of you to go around. Something in your life, your family, your health, something's going to suffer. So if you're part time, you've got to find that healthy balance to weigh out. Okay, this is how much time I can give at the church. This is my other job. This is my family, and even my own personal health. You got to find that balance. Do you talk about that about as far as having that balance in your life?
Well, that's ultimately how it plays out. And it's how it played out in the church that I'm a part of, I started doing a leadership development course. And one of the things at the conference recently, my co-author, Amy Lynch, told the story of the pastor who was just burned out, exhausted, not sure he could continue, and all these kinds of things. And then, we went through this workshop. We identified a number of leaders, and there were a lot of other things that happened. So many people in the church leaned in once they were asked to get involved. Someone started working on operations. Someone took over Sunday morning and like all the logistics. And so it went from 60, 70 hours of work, exhaustion, burnout, to all of a sudden he's taking a step back. He's working on the ministry rather than in the ministry a lot of the times. And he's getting home in time for dinner and all these things. And she said it was like a new lease on life. Yeah. And then she drops the bomb on everybody. And I'm married to him. She's like, this is the pastor's wife. Yeah. She got to see from this, it was a church plant. It was a startup in my entrepreneurial language. Yeah. And got to see it get to this point where it was almost overwhelming. But then this move to start to place leaders, some paid staff leaders, but some volunteer leaders, recruited them, equipped them and activated them to get them to take ownership over these different things. And then all of a sudden it's being able to step back and, to go on a fishing trip with their kids, to take a vacation. Yep. Even, I remember in my first workshop when I met with the pastors and they were doing strategic planning, I used a word you'd have thought I used a 4-letter word when I said it, and all of them looked at me and aghast, like, how dare you suggest this idea? I used the word sabbatical.
I knew what words you're going to say, because we've run into the same thing with the Soul Care Essentials Conference. Well, ours isn't just sabbatical. Ours is Sabbath. They look at me like I'm nuts when I say that you should take a day off every week.
Sabbath is the day they preach.
Right? Yeah. Hey, that's not your day off. You're working.
No, that is a work day. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, it's been so enriching for me. I just remember that moment when all three of them looked at me like I had three heads.
Yes.
When I
always say that like I'm speaking a foreign language. That's the way they look at me.
Yeah. So our lead pastor spent a whole summer in Costa Rica for his sabbatical.
Mm.
Our pastor, kind of executive pastor, spent the summer driving all over the Western United States with a big like van with
Mm-hmm.
their kids, and the other pastor just went to a shore spot that they liked with the wife, and just
Yep.
spent the summer enjoying that. And watching all three of them come back from that, in some ways, all the things that they were doing to prepare the church to be able to operate without them doing everything, it was like it wasn't quite there, but stepping away for 3 months actually let all the systems come to maturity. So when they came back, they didn't have to come back to the 70-hour work week. They didn't have to come back to the expectations that they were doing everything. All that weight had been redistributed. And now they were able to take a breath and think about, like, why don't we plan the sermon content for an entire year? Or why don't we talk about addressing underserved people in our community who desperately need the gospel and desperately need help that we can provide?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we start to think through how we might deliver that? And so you just see all these things coming from that shift. And sabbatical is not just a break, it's an opportunity to reflect and to consider God's calling and vision, and to let the systems all do what they're supposed to do when there's nobody to impact on.
I remember hearing, he's passed on now, but on the West Coast, Pastor Jack Hayford, I heard him tell a story one time that he was part of a church that became what his church was called the Church on the Way. But at first, it was just a small church, and it grew and it grew and it grew, and so it was experiencing in the seventh year explosive growth. And he was just trying to figure out all this stuff, and they were building buildings, and he said he was in his prayer time that morning. He shows the story, and the Lord spoke to him very clearly and said, "You're getting in my way." And that's when he started taking a 7-week sabbatical every 7 years. And he just talked about, he said, I'm trying to get some things done, and you're bogging it up. And so he said, he felt very clearly the Lord said, you need to go on a sabbatical. So he had an executive pastor that he went to talk to, and he said, listen, I need to ask you a question. I want you to be totally honest with me. And the executive pastor said, okay. He said, did God tell you anything about me today? And he said, yes, sir. He said, what did he say? He said, you're getting in his way. And so that guy actually confirmed it. And so he took the 7-week sabbatical, the first time he'd ever done it. And when he took that sabbatical, all this stuff came together that became what the church is. And I was thinking as you were talking with just the group you talked about now, when we get out of the way, we give chances for what we've implemented to actually take root. It's kind of like planting and sowing garden and that kind of thing. If you dig it up every week, it's never going to grow.
Yeah.
But let's do this. Let's take a short break, and then I want to dive into your book and how it ties into all this. So we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with John. Back here with John Wilson, talking through his new book, The Nehemiah Way, and just really loving learning about entrepreneurship and training pastors. So tell me how Nehemiah Way fits into all this.
Sure. Well, I mentioned before, my interest in the book of Nehemiah started when I was 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My mom had a Bible study in her neighborhood, and it started and went for at least 20 years. And women in the neighborhood all got together, and it was just so many people over the years. When she passed away, I heard so many people say that, first I found Jesus through that Bible study,
Mm-hmm.
or I really grew in my faith. And, she was just faithfully serving her community in that way. Well, at one point she decided to do a study on Nehemiah. And so she invited me to be part of a little skit to demonstrate, the wine bearer bringing wine to the king and the story of Nehemiah. And I had no idea what wine was. I had no, like all this is like
4 years old.
Cupbearers. Like I was 4 years old. I know, but I'm like, if there's a king, there's got to be a throne. So I start pulling all the, shabby old blue cushions off the old couch and building a throne. But then I'm like, oh, well, you got to sit on the throne. You got to be the king. Cause I want to be Nehemiah, of course, the hero's journey and all that. So I think that was the first time I really was sensitized to this story. And I think what struck me, and this may have been me as a 4-year-old kind of playing this part, thinking, I'm small, I can't do anything.
Uh-huh.
And Nehemiah was just, arguably one of the most uninteresting people in the Bible. They literally call him the administrator.
Yeah.
And yet, if you read the book, and I think part of it is if you read the text just straight through for the first time, it feels like Ezra Part 2. It feels like a very dry kind of account, like an administrative account.
Mm-hmm.
But if you unpeel the onion a little bit,
Yeah.
you find what's probably one of the most exciting stories in scripture. And in the end, you take away this idea. It was a miracle. They were able to build this wall in 52 days.
Mm-hmm.
But Nehemiah gave us an account that showed, well, technically, it wasn't a miracle. Every detail was recorded. It was all achievable in human terms.
Yeah.
However, we've all been around people,
Mm-hmm.
and getting a group of people to do anything in a coordinated way is almost impossible,
Yeah.
let alone in a short period of time. So the miracle is that God was obviously doing this work, but he gave Nehemiah, and by extension of his leadership, all of these other people the opportunity to come in and get involved.
Yeah, I remember hearing probably my favorite message I ever heard preached about Nehemiah, where the town was called Ono, that and it was like there were some people trying to distract him from his leadership, to try to get him off point, get him to come down from the wall, and the whole message was, "Oh no, I can't come down," and because there was a group trying to distract him from what God had called him to do. I think that happens to us every week, pastoring.
Yeah, absolutely.
We get distracted a lot.
Yeah. Well, and keep in mind, they weren't just trying to distract him. They were trying to off him.
I know.
They wanted him to get
Let's
down
get him down here so we can take you out.
Right. They're taking him out. And the thing of it is, he has a royal guard, with him. It's like it was not going to be a small thing to take him out. And it was an act of desperation when they got there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there were so many different ways and tactics. Nehemiah had one advantage. He had one thing that Ezra didn't have. He had one thing that Zerubbabel did not have. He had his enemy's playbook.
Oh, yeah.
Because so you think about the record. So Nehemiah, first of all, I think a lot of times people think Nehemiah was like a lowly servant in the king's court, which is impossible.
Yeah, couldn't have been high up.
Yeah, he had to have been in a very critical role, like almost like, chief of hospitality or something like that. Because even to be in the presence of the king, you'd have to be at a certain level, and and even just for the king to take him seriously and credibly as a governor, mm-hmm. he would have already had to have demonstrated some pretty serious leadership skills and capabilities and organizational skills. So you have all those things happening. And then it's like he comes in, he would have had access to all the records mm-hmm. and all the, it's like, because you go back to Ezra, it's like, well, who did he have trouble with? Sanballat, mm-hmm. Geshem, Tobiah, same cast of characters.
Yep.
And what did they do? They accused him of sedition. They, disrupted the work. They caused fear among the people. They had threats. And so Nehemiah had their playbook. He already knew clearly what it was they were going to do, because he just wouldn't stop at anything. Not a single thing. Like you're threatened with the charges of treason, not even, hey, I'm doing God's work. It's like, charges with, what are you doing? Or you're not capable. You're not competent, like all these different things. And then, come down. We want to see, like, he knew the playbook. He already had the responses. And when you see the intricacies of his preparation, that was part of it. Even his route more or less circumvented a lot of these territories. He delayed having to have a confrontation as long as he could. So just really exciting things below the surface.
Yeah.
Just in this story that, we think we have adversity. It's mm-hmm. like he had an army literally at the gates.
Yep.
And so, it's just very exciting story.
So I'm pastoring a small church. Let's say I'm pastoring a church of 80 people, and we're just cruising along. I would really like to go to the next level with the church, but we're stalled. Just that's where we are. What can I take?
That's a great phrase. It's almost like there should be a book called "Stalled."
Hey, maybe somebody will write one. So I'm at this point, and I'm learning about you and this. What can I take from your book that would help me get my church moving in the right direction?
Yeah. One thing, I've done this with entrepreneurs for years, and I've started doing it when I talk to pastors. I ask them to consider what would happen or how they would handle their church if they were incapacitated to a large degree mm-hmm. for a period of time. I imagine, I remember, my father, when he was in mid-60s, had a heart attack.
Yeah.
And he had to step away from work, which was very demanding. It was almost like, well, how am I ever going to step away from work? He had to step away from work for 6 months for surgery, to recover, all those mm-hmm. kinds of things. And yet he was able to be a leader in our home in ways that he hadn't been as a result.
Okay.
But, for a leader, a pastor, it's like, well, what would happen if you stepped away? Talk about the sabbatical. What would happen if you step away? Most pastors would say everything would just come to pieces.
Yep. Yep.
First of all, like who's going to preach on Sunday
Yep.
would be the first thing. And so, so the first thing I would say is, just taking a step back and documenting like, what are all the things that you do every week? A lot of times when I work with entrepreneurs, I ask them to come up with 8 or 10 buckets of like the big categories of what they do and percentage of their time in each bucket.
Yeah.
And then what I challenge them to do is, okay, ignore that column. Now write what it should be.
Yeah. See, I think that's great for pastors because specifically small church pastors are so busy, but I often ask, doing what? And I'm not saying you're not doing important things, but sometimes just the thought of what we got to do will take us hours.
Yeah.
And most of us don't control our calendar. Our calendar controls us, or most of us don't have blocked off time that we don't let people interrupt. And so it's kind of like people own us almost. You can't be entrepreneurial and have people owning you.
Exactly. And that's the first part of it is getting control of that calendar.
Yeah.
Deciding, because otherwise the tyranny of the urgent
Yes.
will rule the day.
And every day there's something urgent.
That's right. There's always going to be something urgent. Well, and the question is, who do you call when something urgent comes up? Because usually pastors say, I just take care of it. It's the quickest, easiest path. And I was having a conversation recently about someone where a church really failed to care for and support a family that really needed it in a particular way. There was like this immediate jump in and flurry of activity, but then it was like, there was no follow-up. There was no, and so the people actually weren't served the way they really should have been. And it was not because of any ill intent, because it was a drop everything. Let's go and help. But then, then the next thing came along and that got dropped along with everything else to go to the next thing.
One of our things that we say about small churches, and I think this is true of other churches as well, but we're known for not following through, and then there's no accountability. So we announce we're going to do this major promotion at Easter, and we talk about it for 2 months, and then we get close to Easter, and it doesn't happen, and nobody says anything about it. And
Right.
it really ties into what you're saying, because what happens is that church, those people tend to leave the church, they're hurt, and we just keep on going on with life. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the recent study, 40 million people have left the church.
Yeah, that's
in the
unbelievable.
last few years. The de-churching is happening for sure.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is people are just not finding that they're being drawn into that community. They're not, there's no system to support them in the places that they have needs. So, my question to pastors is, okay, an urgent request just came in. Who are you going to call? And the answer to that should probably not just be the one person, or if it is one person, it's somebody that's, then going to make the next call. But, it's like, okay, the sound system stopped working on Saturday afternoon. Who are you going to call? It's like a family in the church, like there was a car accident. One of the spouses was killed. Who are you going to call? It's like, there's a kind of a
And when you
crisis.
say this, you're saying who's the pastor going to call?
That's right. Yeah. Who's the pastor going to call? Because the thing of it is, they may get that first call.
Sure, they usually do.
They usually do. No matter. And now, I mean, when things are really done well, they aren't the first one to get the call.
Yeah.
They get the call from the person who's already dealing with it.
Yes.
Hey, just wanted to let you know, so-and-so's, parent just passed away, or there's someone's in the hospital or something like that. But yeah, it's who are you going to call? And a lot of times like there isn't anyone, so they just take care of it.
Yeah.
And even if they called somebody, that person, like, what are they going to do? Well, then you just have kind of moved the problem from one person to the next.
Yeah.
But what if you had someone who's responsible to oversee part of the mission or the ministry, and they've developed their own team of leaders and volunteers, so that they have a whole team of people that they, because they might be hitting group me with a message to say, hey, such and such family needs somebody to watch their kids right now. Who's available?
Yeah.
And so having that cascading system where you know exactly who you're going to call. And I just think about an example recently where on Easter Sunday, and this was a church that, 6 years ago was like pastors are burned out and those kinds of things. There was a massive project going on to completely renovate the sanctuary, basically too small and need more seats, and pushing the stage back to a little less on stage, a little more in the seats, right?
Yeah.
And so that was happening, massive, 60 volunteers within the church involved in a construction project, and a couple of people that's what they do. And so it's just really such a blessing to have leaders that know
Yep.
the thing that they're working on. Well, at the same time, there was a decision to do Easter service in the park for the community, and expecting 300 guests in the community outside, weather, all these things. And the timing was such that it wasn't, going inside wasn't even an option. So of course, 200 people mobilized to pray.
Yeah, for weather.
For weather, right?
Yeah.
But and it was, to me, it was just awesome I was walking in from the parking area with the lead pastor 15 minutes before the service. And he's like asking me about the week and all that kind of stuff. And we're just, he's as calm as could be. He's ready. He's going to preach in 15, half an hour. And we walk in, and I mean, the sound system is rolling. There's like, 600 people are there. There's tents filled with like donuts and cider and coffee. There's gifts and stuff for the kids. There's all this. And, it was like 100 volunteers involved in that. At the same time, you got more than 60 people involved in doing a massive renovation. And 6 years ago, there were 3 people doing everything.
Yeah. And again, you don't get there overnight. You've got to make the decision to shift toward leading this way. But again, if it offends you to talk about the word leadership, or if it offends you to talk about the word entrepreneurial, it can't offend you to talk about equipping. And that's exactly what we are called to do in Ephesians 4. Jesus gave us these gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, to equip saints to do ministry. And what happens is, that by the time you get to verse 16, you have everybody involved doing their fulfillment. So honestly, raising up people, releasing people, stepping back actually brings great community, a cohesiveness, unity, and purpose. But for some reason, we fail to step into this.
Well, let me turn that around on you, Dale.
All right.
Imagine if we robbed the people and the members of the congregation of the opportunity.
That's what I'm
For
saying.
that kind of discipleship, for the opportunity for that type of evangelism, for the opportunity for that type of
Well, the event you just spoke of would not have happened if just the 3 guys were doing it all.
Impossible.
Couldn't have happened. They couldn't have done the renovation, and they couldn't have done the big service.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was interesting. About a month before the book was released, Ronnie Martin came and preached at our church. Ronnie Martin is the head of the Harbor Network, if you're familiar with that. It's a network of churches. And he had read my book. He had gotten an early copy of my book and wrote an endorsement for it. But we hadn't met in person. So I, after the service was over, I went up and introduced myself to he and his wife, and we were talking for a little bit. And I thanked him for writing the really kind words that he wrote. I was really just humbled and blown away by some of the things he said. And the day he was preaching, though, he watched us install 11 new deacons.
Cool.
And these weren't backfill roles, so to speak, using corporate terminology. These were expansion roles.
Gotcha.
And then what was really interesting for me is when we did the workshop series a couple of years ago, the first one, when we essentially introduced the Nehemiah Way, about half the people on that stage were part of that first workshop.
Cool.
Series.
That's so cool.
And so it's such a cool moment to see God mobilizing people, because they're getting the opportunity to be part of this mission that he's calling us on. He's going to get it done with or without us, but there's this opportunity to get involved. And that's the part that's really exciting about it.
So if some pastor's listening right now and they're going, I really want to buy into this, but I'm a little nervous about starting, what would be the first step?
Well, the first step, I would say, read the book of Nehemiah through a different lens than you've ever read it before.
Okay.
Read it through the lens of, because there's so many great commentaries. There's so much rich opportunity for just personal spiritual growth and development, those kinds of things when you read the book. But this time, read it with a practical lens on for a minute.
Yeah.
Look at the way he prayed. And that's an interesting thing that happens in Nehemiah. There's a literary thing that's happening. It's like something happens, Nehemiah prays, and then Nehemiah acts. And then a little later, something happens, Nehemiah prays, then Nehemiah acts. And this happens over and over and over. So the first thing is just looking at it in terms of how he prayed. But then what you see, and you kind of have to infer it backwards. He gives his pitch deck, as I like to call it, to the king. This is the entrepreneur in me, says, Nehemiah had a pitch deck. he gives his pitch deck. And what that pitch deck reveals is that Nehemiah had spent an enormous amount of time planning and preparing. And they are two different things, but they're inextricably linked, because he was in his planning, he was determining what was going to be needed from a preparation perspective. And by the way, sometimes people read Nehemiah and think like his brother came, he heard the bad news, he was bummed out. The king's like, what's wrong? He's like, the walls are destroyed. Oh, go ahead and fix it. No, 5 months took place.
Yeah.
5 months passed from the month of Chislev to the month of Nisan. That's like November to April. And what was he doing in that time? Well, first he was praying.
Absolutely.
I actually think the prayer that you see in the book of Nehemiah, one of the most powerful frameworks for prayer I can think of, and is there. But I mean, it showed his thoughtful development. He might have spent weeks developing that prayer, and it might have been a meditation that he had every day for a period of time, because you see us walk through adoration, confession, hope, fearing God, imploring acceptance, redemption, and supplication. And he's really showing us a new way to pray. And I have to tell you, every time I look at that framework, I'm like, supplication, that's like 99.9% of my prayer life is like, hey, God, I got a request.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's 1 out of 8, and it's the last one when Nehemiah is doing this. And so you see this prayer that's really addressing what I say is the hard issue. Because one of the things I say about the book of Nehemiah, it's not about the wall.
Yes.
Everybody thinks about the wall, and it's like, it's not about the wall. It's about sin, it's about restoration, and it's about redemption. And you really see that stage set in the prayer that then leads to the pitch, which is actually showing his preparation, his planning and preparation.
Yeah.
And so as a pastor, when you read this book, read it through that lens of, not like, what can I do tomorrow to make my church better? I mean, you should always be thinking that way, but this is, no, what can I do over the next 5 years? And what would if I were going to spend a dedicated period of time planning and preparing, how am I going to roll that out?
Yep.
And so that it just gives you this template for doing it. And then the last thing I'll say is, don't skip chapter 3.
All right. Well, why would I not skip it?
Well, first, why you would skip it. Most people get to chapter 3 and say, wow, this looks a lot like the Leviticus. I think I'll flip over to chapter 4 when things start to get exciting.
Okay.
Why? It's a big list of names.
Yeah.
And list of names and the Bible, it's like for some of us seeing algebra equations. It's like, okay, I'm out.
Yeah.
Right? If you unpack chapter 3, you see the leadership structure, you see the operations model, you see the operating system is really what you see there. Because what he's doing is he's showing you there's some things that you see when you start to see the people. He starts at the top of this thing, he works himself all the way around, tells you who the champion was, who the group of people was that did the work, and what section of the wall they worked on. But there's some other things that you get to unpack. Number one, he didn't do the whole city. He narrowed the scope.
Yeah.
He said, we're just doing this little bit, but it was symbolic, but it was relevant. The other thing is he phased the project. It came in 2 phases. They first built the wall. They repaired and built the wall to 4 feet. And for a number of reasons, I think it was how they stabilized the foundation of it. It's also a much more defensible position than no wall in some places.
Yeah.
But then the second phase, they went from 4 feet to 8 feet. Then the segments, what's revealed is 46 segments, and they each have a champion. So you have a person who takes ownership of their section. On average, about 300 feet, 300 or 400 feet of wall. Some of them longer, some of them shorter. And I think that phase let them catch up. So if there were people that were behind, it was like this group, okay, you're at 4 feet, go over here and help them. And so you had that, because when the opposition came, they were better ready to defend themselves. Yeah. And then they kind of trained everybody. They basically changed the standard operating procedures. Okay, we're not just building with both hands now. We're, everybody's strapped with a sword. You're, spear in one hand, build with the other. You got somebody hold the bundle of spears. So you see this operating system in very practical terms. So that's the thing. First thing I would say is read the book of Nehemiah through the lens of how could I really, seek God's vision and calling, and then how do I build a plan and prepare so that people are ready to step into leadership roles and start to take on ownership of some of these things.
It's important that we do all 3. And I find that of those 3 words you use, prayer and then planning and preparation, we tend to do 2 of those. And there's all kind of combinations of how we do that, but we really need all three. I think one of the things we're missing a lot in American churches today is a God-sized vision. I mean, typically we do what we can do, whereas he wants to do much more than that. But if we don't do the praying, we'll never know. Man, I tell you what, I love this. Oh, how can folks get a copy of your book? And I'm gonna have a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can get a copy on Amazon.
Okay.
You can get a paper copy. It's on Kindle. We just released it on Audible. So if you prefer to listen in your car, you can do that. The other thing is, if you want to get a free resource guide, I have that available at thenehemiahway.com.
Okay.
And you can download that. I've also launched a YouTube channel called The Nehemiah Way. And right now I'm kind of going chapter by chapter, breaking down, kind of showing my homework, which I really wanted to do along the way. Didn't have a chance to. This summer, I'm going to do the first, we're calling it Mobilize Your Church Summer Cohort. It's for pastors. It's between around the middle of July to the end of August.
Okay.
To be able to, you're going to join a small group. It's going to be limited number of pastors and elders of churches that just want to, dive in and kind of work through an intentional path to, really build out that prayer kind of plan, and then the plan itself, and then the preparation to launch really leadership development at your church.
Well, we're going to put everything, all these links in the show notes, and this podcast will drop in time for people who would like to be part of that cohort to reach out to you. So I hope you guys will take advantage of it. Man, it's been a pleasure just to get to hang out with you. Obviously, we could talk all day long about this kind of stuff, but I'm really excited about what you have written and what you're sharing with us, and the fact that you've got success stories to go with it. It's a lot of people talk about things that we never know if they work, but this works.
Absolutely. Yeah. And my prayer would be that for those that are early in ministry, that are ambitious for gospel mission, that this is going to help them to launch in a way that they don't feel stalled. But for those who do feel stalled, another plug, Dale Seller's great book here. For those who do feel stalled, hopefully this is a way that can, just help aid your efforts to really move to that place where who you're going to call. The church is doing what it's supposed to do, and it's not contingent on you, so that it's ready for the next generation.
Dude, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dale. This is great.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.